Now, I'm also joined by James Woudhuysen, a visiting professor at London's South Bank University. Does modelling always look at worst-case scenarios, or is this something that in a crisis, we could forgive the government, given that Professor Lockdown, that Neil Ferguson himself, said that if the government had locked down a week earlier, the start of the pandemic, there would have been half the deaths. So surely we can forgive them for basically toying with worst-case scenarios.
Well, I wouldn't forgive them, and I wouldn't forgive the forecasters either. I mean, at no point in my memory of this crisis has anybody used a simple phrase which statisticians usually use about forecasts, which is the degree of confidence, the confidence level they attach to particular forecasts. And if you're at 95 or 97% confident, then you're pretty confident. But they never discuss that because, as Tamandra Harkness said, the assumptions are opaque. There is a sort of spurious, this must be the truth aspect to the whole modelling business, which is because we deal in numbers, they're neutral, equations, they're neutral, we're just strictly a priesthood for technocracy, and what we say is the truth. And it's just not the case. The equations that you select, the assumptions that you make, the questions that you ask, very importantly, the questions that government asks of forecasters, to a large degree determine the outcome. The algebra, Alex, is much more important than the arithmetic. It's what you start off with that's so important. And that's a black box to the general public. It's probably a black box to Boris Johnson, for all he knows about forecasting. So then what you come to is the outcome, which generally sells a lot of newspapers. And what's going to sell a lot of newspapers? Is it going to be, the news today is roughly the same as it was yesterday. We've got nothing alarming to report. In fact, it's one whole bore. You might as well turn on to the leisure section. No, they're going to want big headlines and so on. The government wants to have that narrative of fear because it makes sure that the populace is pliant and does what it says. And that's really the stage that we've come to.
If Sage had been your students and you'd been marking their number theatre, their slideshows after every press conference, what sort of grade would you give them? Do you think we can trust the stats and the science, as the government keeps alluding to, or do you think that we should all be very wary?
Well, they don't discuss the counter tendencies to their forecasts. They don't discuss nearly enough the what-ifs and so on. And the question we've got to ask, Alex, is why are they so consistently pessimistic and so consistently wrong? Neil Ferguson, but all the rest of them. And the answer is that they have set off from broadly the politics of the 80s, really. If you remember, in 1987, Margaret Thatcher, of all people, sent a leaflet to 23 million households in this country saying, don't die of AIDS. 23 million leaflets she sent out. So, the alarmism about the future and the sense of uncertainty is something that we hear invoked so much. You can always be certain that people will be talking up the uncertainty. And what we often fail to do is recognize that it's through experiment, through science, through the development of vaccines, and most recently through the development of antiviral drugs to treat people who are hospitalized, that we can turn the uncertainty that surrounds into a disease into calculated risk. We can work out what really is going on. Instead, all we do today is play up the uncertainty, and because the politicians don't know what to believe in anymore, they do defer to forecasters, and the result is, broadly, that they want the sort of paralysis scenario put forward, because then they cannot be blamed for anything that goes wrong, and the real deaths that happen through cancer, and the disturbance through mental health, and the disruption of our schools is not factored in. That's the other thing about all the forecasting. You're not factoring in even a vulgar cost-benefit analysis, let alone the overall damage to economy, society, education, and all the rest of it. That's not, it's just a purely medical, mathematical, discussion that they want us into. And generally speaking, their own loss of direction dictates a sense of uncertainty and therefore of fear.
This has been replicated around the world, though. I mean, the approach of lockdowns and Professor Neil Ferguson's initial modelling have been used widely, broadly adopted by the WHO even. Do you think that's been a global mistake?
Well, with all of these institutions, you've got to ask a little bit, not in a conspiratorial manner, but, what's their track record? What's their funding? What's their outlook? How corrupt are they? Especially when you're looking at United Nations institutions like the World Health Organization. Now, if you look at their record in relation to previous viruses, especially avian flu and these sorts of things, their record is not consistent. It's marred in a whole lot of politics. It was exactly the same with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the domain of climate, where also fears run rife all the time. So these are not neutral, purely scientific, disinterested, miraculously funded, well-meaning people 24 hours a day. It's not how it works, not how science works. As you yourself pointed out, it's a contested terrain. It's one in which people take positions. And therefore, this sort of kind of robe of neutrality and of respectability and of authority that we can never question them.
The science.
The science, right? It's not science, it's scientism. And the old scientism in the Cold War would tell you how many Vietnamese villages to bomb next with a spreadsheet, a primitive spreadsheet. The new scientism says, do what we say, because we are right. That's it. No more democracy. It's extremely dangerous for democracy, extremely dangerous for the future of politics in this country. The modelers have a lot to answer for.
Wow. Tough note to end on. James, thank you so much for coming into the studio. It's been an absolute pleasure. James Woudhuysen there, who's visiting professor at London South Bank University.